Chapter 1. The intense heat of the day was far less tolerable than it was over her prior days of travel. Perhaps it was because her slight body was working harder now that she was forced to walk instead of riding her mare. The muscles in Ari's legs were screaming for relief, and her body was sweating to the point that she was offending herself. She'd lost her sunscreen, wide-brimmed straw hat, and sunglasses at the same time she'd lost her mare. Her short, flaxen hair was matted to her head from the sweat that seemed to ooze out of every pore of her body. Her clothes were so soaked with it that she was certain that if she wrung them out there'd be a goodly amount of liquid released. She needed to find shade and rest, but when the realization of the futility of her situation sank in, she ran in a panic without paying attention to where she was going, and she was no longer on the intended route. Nothing looked familiar. After her recent overwhelming encounter with a small band of intelligent zombies that managed to take her unaware, she worried over stopping just about anywhere. She was exhausted and didn't trust herself to be alert enough should another group of zombies come along. Even so, she knew her body's limitations. It was a dilemma. She hesitated, stopping in the event of another zombie encounter, and yet she feared not stopping because if she exhausted her body any longer without letting it rejuvenate, she'd be worthless should another crisis such as another zombie encounter occur. The petite young woman checked her surroundings for something that might look familiar. Even though she was no longer on her intended route, she'd been through this territory hundreds of times while searching for Kendra or others at the council at Centerland had assigned her to hunt and bring back to them. She just needed to find a familiar landmark to tell her where she was, and she'd be able to get her bearings back in order. She cursed herself for not being more observant. Her mare had been so dependable and knowing of the areas that they patrolled that she'd paid minimal attention to things like landmarks to help her find a way to and from a location. Now, her mare was gone and she was on her own. Sinking onto the hard-packed soil, she settled beneath a tree that was giving its all to stay alive in such a barren area. Its sparse foliage offered the best amount of shade. She couldn't help wondering how much thicker the foliage on the rugged little tree would be had it been located in more lush surroundings, as she rested her back that was thick with sweat against the trunk's rough bark. The sickening memories of her mare being torn to pieces by the band of zombies tormented her, even more than the pounding headache that she'd developed from excessive sun exposure. Memories of the equine's blood curdling screeching as it was eaten alive competed with the thunderous pounding of 100 sledgehammers inside her head. Tears of sorrow and regret for not being more observant and aware of the zombies' approach until it was too late, mixed with grungy, sticky sweat as they rolled over her cheeks and onto her neck, leaving a telltale path through the dust that had settled on her normally pale flesh that was reddened from the sun. Hugging her knees, she buried her face into them and closed her eyes. If she could just shut out the sight and sound of her poor mare's demise long enough to rest and relieve her head of the incessant pounding, perhaps she'd be better able to focus on where she was and get herself headed into the right direction again. She was familiar with the area, she knew this. She just couldn't think. She needed to be able to think. The humming of a drone sent by the alien regime to patrol the land passing overhead caught her attention, and she scrambled to make herself as invisible as possible in such a desolate landscape. Felix placed his hands against the small of his back as he stood up and stretched out the kinks in it. He'd been weeding in the garden for so long that he practically lost track of time. Surely Eugene would be waking up from his nap soon. Since both Kendra and Rex were off hunting, it was up to him to care for his infant nephew. He smiled at the thought. This was a task that he took great pleasure in, and would have probably competed for the right to do even if his parents were home. Given his work an approving nod, he clapped his hands together to get off as much of the soil of them as possible and headed back to the main house. At the sound of a drone flying overhead, he quickly slid beneath the porch of the nearest building. This was the first drone that he'd seen in a very long time, and the very first that had flown over the compound since their arrival over a year ago. Life had been so calm and complete that he'd almost forgotten that the world was now run by an alien regime, and that life outside of this little nucleus was anything but pleasant. The drone was a sharp reminder. He peered out from his hiding place as he watched the mechanical spy fly so low it almost landed in the centre green. It looked much larger close-up than he thought them to be when seen from afar. His breathing grew ragged and his heart thrashed against his ribcage as he watched the top of the drone lift open and a mechanical arm with a camera attached slowly rise out of it. Lights of various colours flashed and a series of loud beeps filled the air as the camera gradually moved in a 360-degree circle while snapping photos with rapid repetition.